Okay, let's try this again. So it's May 18th, it's interpersonal communications, and we're going to talk about chapter 1 from the textbook. And we start out with a couple of things. When the question of why study interpersonal communications, we talked last week about how they will lead to personal success because so many employers say that recent college graduates are not good at communicating, even though studies also show that college graduates think they're great at communicating. So therefore, if you're the person who actually can communicate, you're going to have more likely, you're going to stand out, and it's going to help with your professional success. It's also going to help with your personal success because you're going to have better relationships. You're going to be able to make yourself understood, and you're going to be able to understand people better, hopefully, as you learn more about interpersonal communication. The name of the book is Foundations of Interpersonal Communication. Okay, so some of the learning objectives are: first, identify the benefits, which we've kind of covered, then define and explain what is interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication simply is the interactions between two and sometimes more people. That really, it's sort of all the communication you have, emails, texts, conversations, telephone communication, letters, all of that. Anything really that's not mass media, mass communication, or public speaking is going to be interpersonal. And then a lot of times there's an overlap between interpersonal communications and public speaking. So it's about the communication you have in your relationships between yourself and other people. Now, there are a lot of essential elements that they define in the first chapter. One of these is source receiver. Anybody want to guess what source receiver is? Heismer, if you and I are in a conversation, are you the source or are you the receiver?
You're like telling me the information that you have, so it's like coming to me.
I'm sorry, say that again?
You're like telling me the information, so it's coming to me.
Yeah, if we're in a lecture situation, I'm the source and you're the receiver. How about if we're talking right now?
I'm like receiving like all the info that you have.
Yeah. You're actually both, because if I ask you a question and you answer it, I become the receiver, you become the source. Does that make sense? So every time you're talking to me, now here's the thing. It goes beyond that, because let's say we were in a face-to-face situation and I was asking you questions and you were shrugging and you were sitting back in your chair and your eyes were shifting around the room and you were giving me all kinds of nonverbal signals that said you weren't really interested or you really didn't know the information or whatever. Would you be sending me a message even though you weren't speaking at that time?
Yeah, because like you're doing physical moves instead of like verbal.
Yes. So in that case, you're both the source and the receiver, and sometimes simultaneously, you'll be the source and the receiver. And again, the good example is when a teacher talks to a student and the student is hasn't answered verbally, but they're answering non-verbally even as the person is speaking. Police often wind up in the same circumstance, which is why you always want to watch your nonverbal around police if you're stopped for a traffic violation. Also, it's encoding and decoding. What if I looked at your, one person might look at you as you're leaning back in your chair with your fingers clasped, and you're putting your hands behind your head with your elbows kind of extended up on both sides. How can I view that, Heismer?
Say that again. I couldn't hear it.
Yep. You're a student. You're in class. You've got your hands behind your head. You're leaning back with your hands behind your head and your elbows out. How would I interpret that?
You could see like interpreting as like I don't really like care in a situation.
Okay, how else might I interpret it? There are really two ways to interpret that, and they're very, very different. But the other way I might look at it is I might think, wow, this kid is really confident, and whatever he's going to say to me, he's going to be very confident in his answer. Can you see that?
A little bit, not a lot.
Yeah. I think we'll show you a video later on this semester, and you'll get a better look at it, I think. So it's really a matter of how I decode what you're saying to me. And that gets to encoding and decoding. When I say, and the simple word is, we all agree that the term, I don't know, pick a term, agree. What does agree mean? Let's see, who wants to field this one? Courtney, what does the word agree mean?
I'm sorry, what?
What does the word agree mean?
When you agree with someone.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. You mean that when you agree with, to agree means to agree? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's like if you think the same as someone.
Yes,
So
when both parties give the same meaning to the same word, situation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we agree that the word agree means that we both think it's the same thing.
Yes.
Okay. And this is true of every word in the English language that we both understand. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really the basic of encoding and decoding. So when you speak to somebody who speaks Spanish, they might have a different word for a dog, as an example, than you do. So you've got to encode, or they're encoding when they say the word, and I don't even, what's the word for dog in Spanish?
Perro.
Okay, taro with a T or perro with a P?
Perro.
Okay.
With a P.
With a what? Okay, so they say perro. And how do you know, if you're an English speaker and you don't speak Spanish, how do you know what it is? You've got to basically decode it. But if you're a Spanish speaker, you still got to decode it, but your decoding is very, very quick. So we all agree on certain words, and the other words we've got to kind of figure out. But in both cases, what we're doing is we're decoding what's being said and we're encoding what's being said. And that goes for phrases, it goes for sentences, it goes for thoughts. And so obviously it can get a lot more complicated as you go along. But in the simplest form, we're talking about, we use the same language. And the reason that the means what the means is because at some point there was an agreement that this is what the would mean. This is what mom would mean. This was what dad would mean. And so we've got this agreement, and that is the code that we are using. And then we're decoding it, and we're encoding it as we speak, and we're decoding it as we listen. Does that make sense to one and all? You ever been in a situation where somebody said a piece of slang that says, you ever speak around your parents in a way to your friends that is intended for them not to understand the full meaning of what you're saying? No? That's because you're all such good kids.
No, I do.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Honestly, I really can't think of one right now. But like, I guess maybe I just won't say everything that I'm talking about, kind of.
Okay, right. I mean, you ever say to somebody, you're one of your friends, hey, let's go down the mall, when in fact you mean let's go down to Canterbury Lake Park to hang out with your friends? Or, let's go to the library, we've got studying to do, when you actually mean let's go down to the library to hang out with our friends? Probably not. You're such a good, you ever say, let's go out here, we're going to go to the mall, when in fact you're going to go driving around with your friends? Do kids still do that? Do they still drive around?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that might be one where you may not tell your parents you're going to go out to drive around for 2 hours. You might tell them you've got a location in mind. Sometimes you might say we're going to do one thing when in fact you're planning to do something else, or you've got a different motive for going to the mall, going to the library. Maybe you're saying you go to the mall because you've got to buy something specifically for school, or you have to buy something specific, and in fact you're really just going down to hang out. Would that come up? Would that situation ever come up with you?
No.
No? Okay. Then maybe I'm just too, maybe you guys are just so honest that we don't have any good examples of that. But encoding and decoding, how about this? You ever see somebody who says, I just watched Mean Girls, the movie. You all remember Mean Girls, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of encoding and decoding there, like the idea that you're going to buy, you wouldn't buy any clothing without your friends looking at it first. And your friends are going to tell you what they think and what they don't think. And you're going to make your decision based on that. Nobody remembers that from the movie. We'll have to watch the movie. We'll have to go through all of this stuff. But there's sometimes, you ever have the person who says, that looks great, and really what they mean is, that looks horrible, and you have to decode that?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you should all have situations sort of like this in your lives. Somebody who doesn't want to hurt your feelings, but you know they don't want to hurt your feelings, so they say things in a certain way, and then you interpret it to be another way. We'll get into more of that as we get into context, but simply for encoding and decoding, simply we mean this word means this sentence means this, and we both understand it. Messages are the units of communication that you send. So one of the things about interpersonal communication is, as a course, that can make it a little difficult is that it's so obvious. All of this stuff is stuff we do all the time. And yet it's not something we really think about. And it gets very, very complicated as we think about it and break it down and break it down onto all these different bits of meaning. And it's a huge topic, but it's all right in front of us, and it can really seem super simple, and that we're just making it complicated. But messages, it's a unit. I'm going to send you a message. If I say I'm taking attendance at 12:15, hopefully the message I'm sending is that you have to be here at 12:15 in order to get credit. And if I'm saying it after, let's say, 5 or 6 classes, it's either because or let's put it this way, if I'm doing it at the beginning of the semester, I'm trying to set expectations. If I'm doing it midway through the semester, it might be an indicator I'm not happy with the attendance in class. Does that make sense? No?
Yeah.
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 All right. Now we go to channels. That's another essential element of interpersonal communication. Channels is kind of the medium with which you communicate. So that can be face-to-face. It can be on the telephone or a cell phone. It can be on text, email, and it kind of goes on and on and on from there. Letters. In a professional setting, you might communicate with to a broader audience you might use a different method. But there are all these methods that you can communicate with, and these are called channels. The message, as we talked about last week, the message from a text is going to be different from the message for a face-to-face conversation, which is going to be different from a telephone conversation, because the text, you take tone completely out of it. You only have a limited number of words to work with. Face-to-face conversation, you've got to be there in person to do it. But it gives you the advantages of both being able to see the person and be sure, as sure as you can be, that person understands based on their nonverbals, their nonverbal communication with you. And if you're not certain that a message has been received, you can kind of repeat it and be sure that it's been received in the way you intend for it to be received. A cell phone or telephone call is kind of in the middle. You can do it remotely, but you can't see the person. So there are advantages and disadvantages to every channel, but channels are the method that you communicate, the medium. Noise, we're going to talk about this more in a couple of minutes, but noise can be a lot of different things. It can be physical noise. If I'm talking to you and it's a construction site, or if it's a nightclub, you might not be able to hear me. So I might have to shout. I might decide I'm going to limit my message because it's too much work communicating it. Or noise can also be some kind of a physiological, noise can be a contextual noise. Like, let's say you've heard rumors about somebody, and they're really bad rumors, and then you're talking to that person. No matter what that person says, you're going to be thinking about those rumors about that person. Does that make sense? So that's a different kind of noise. You hear when celebrities get into trouble, they'll say, don't listen to the noise, or controversial athletes will say, don't listen to the noise. And really what they're trying to say is, take me at my word, take me, let me prove this to you. So that's what noise is. And noise can certainly get in the way of communication. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Context is both the personal context and the situational context that the message is received in. And that can be everything from, let's say, a supervisor talking to an employee that they're in charge of. It might be a different context than if the employee and the supervisor are friends out of work, away from work. I mean, not out of work, like losing work. Context can be a mother talks to her son in a way that's a little different than an adult woman would talk to a boy who's not related to her. And then we talk about ethics, which is a lot of it's being honest, but it goes a little bit beyond that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So we want you to be able to define all of these essential elements in this course. So again, look for these as look for these to show up again on the midterm and the final. We want you to be able to paraphrase the principles of interpersonal communication. And we're going to talk a little bit about partner communication. You guys are familiar with what this means, right? Partner communication. How many people, when they think about partners, do they think about good friends? How many think about boyfriends or girlfriends? Let's say Chris. Chris, when I talk about partner communication, what do you think? What do you think of it?
Mainly see it as like, when I hear partner, I mainly just see it as like working with someone to achieve an objective.
Okay.
Like in school and stuff like that. You
Sure.
have to like write a project.
In case of in this case, where they're talking about marriages, but I think it really kind of can refer to business partnerships. It can refer to project partnerships, everything from a project you do together at school to something else. But this is talking about marriage partnerships. 53% of marriages that fail, the members, the people who are married say they cite lack of effective communication skills, which I think is the number one reason that marriages fail. 38% is money, and 14% say in-law interference. So obviously communication in a marriage is very important. I would say it's also important in any kind of other partnership situation. So it's something to want to be aware of and to work on. The nature of interpersonal communication, this is one of two slides. It involves interdependent individuals. And by interdependent individuals, it means, and by the way, I've got some typos in here. I apologize for that. I revised it last night and I didn't get the chance to go through it one final time today, but there are going to be a couple of typos, so I apologize. In this case, I've got a capital I on individuals. It involves interdependent individuals. Interdependent means that they're kind of, it's between two individuals. And so those individuals are interdependent in the fact that they are both dependent on the other for the communication's sake, not necessarily for anything else. But the way that I respond to you, the way you respond to me, the way I respond back to you and back and forth, we're both we're both individuals. We're both running our own minds, so to speak. We're both in charge of our own emotions and what we say. But oftentimes what I say to you is based on what you say, that is in reaction and response to what you say to me. Does that make sense to one and all?
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
a fairly simple, it's a fairly simple thing to think about, but it's also, so that's kind of a simple thing. So what you say to one person might be taken one way. What you say to somebody else might be taken another. I'm sure you've all run into that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And it's inherently relational. And then we can get rid of the word inherently here if we wanted, but the nature of communication, communication is relational. You know, if you talk to somebody you don't know that well, you don't tell them certain things that you would tell somebody you do know well. And it exists on a continuum, which is really pretty well illustrated by the next visual. Oh, no, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. I'll come back to this one. Some people say that there's a metaphor of communication being like a seesaw. I give you some information, you give me some information. We'll come back to that one though. We'll go to the continuum. If you look way to the left on the impersonal side, you've got the server and a customer. Do any of you work as servers in restaurants?
I used to.
Okay, so you know that there are certain things that are absolutely appropriate for you to say to a customer. And then there are certain things you would never say to a customer that you would say that you would reserve that for your friends. Is that about correct?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be polite to the customer. You'd ask them like what they'd want to eat. And if they want to chit chat, you'd chit chat with them. But if they wanted to know really personal information, that would be entirely out of place. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
What kind of a place did you work at? Who is this, by the way?
Allison.
Oh, hey, Allison. What kind of a place did you work at?
I worked at a breakfast place.
Okay, so you probably had people coming in, and some people probably asked you about they probably did ask you about yourself, right? Like,
Yeah, a lot of my customers were like older, like regulars, so like
Yep.
they wanted to get to know me.
yeah, they wanted to chit chat a little bit. So they might say, "Are you in school?" They might say, "What's the most personal question they asked you? Can anything stick out?"
One time one of my customers got mad because my manager was having a mental breakdown and was screaming at the employees.
Ooh.
And she told me that I should quit my job.
Okay, yeah, it might have been good advice. Did you take her advice?
Yeah, I quit.
Okay, there you go. That's that sounds like it might have been good advice. Did you ever have people say, I mean, I assume people would say, do you go to school? Do you live here in was it in Haverhill?
Yeah.
So did they probably ask you, did you go to Haverhill High School?
Yeah, they asked me about that in like school and stuff, like what colleges I want to go to and stuff.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's that sort of stuff. And then I think sometimes you'll find people will get a little more personal, like, do you have a boyfriend? What college you're going to go to? You know, all of those things that are, you know, I don't know. You know, it's kind of probably, I'm sure it's benign in most cases. But,
Yeah, I've gotten all of those questions before.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah, like one time a customer asked me if I was dating my other like coworker, but he was like way like 10 years older than me. So it was like really awkward.
That is awkward. Yeah, it's always interesting when somebody goes a little bit beyond where they should be. In the same way, if a server, you know, as a server, you're probably going to offer some advice about the food, but you probably don't offer much advice beyond that to the customers. I'm trying to think of what it might be. I'm trying to think of anything inappropriate a server said to me. Usually they don't. I mean, it would be a kind of an odd thing. But did you ever feel like you had gone beyond the continuum when you were dealing with customers?
No, I kind of just like stuck to like my usual responses because like I had so many customers like asking me the same questions. I kind of like like rehearsed, like what to say back.
Yeah, it's almost like it's almost like that. You know, you've got your things that people always say. I know when I deal with other comedians, so often I hear particularly the more veteran comedians, when they would talk to me when I was starting, I would hear the same things. And with some of them, I would think to myself, this is the same thing that this person has said to 100 other people, and he's just on autopilot when he's talking to me. And I would find that either I personally wouldn't, you know, to a certain point, it was like I didn't want to have a conversation you had with a million other people. So I was either going to change the subject, or I was just going to end the conversation and go find something else to do. But I think a lot of us get into these, I think to a certain extent, these are necessary rituals of the job. Now, as we see on the right side, the interpersonal, which is the more personal stuff, you know, lovers, married couples, parents and children, best friends, members of a social network, group, or circle. As you can see, if you move to the right, you're getting more and more close. And if you move to the left, you're getting less and less close. Neighbors, you have a lot of the same conversations that you would have if you were a server and a customer. Casual friends, you're not going to share with them certain things that you're going to share with your close friends. So it all really depends. This is odd. How did that happen exactly? I'm now the host. I'm now the host of the meeting.
What just happened?
I don't know.
The sound was cutting out, so I don't know.
Yeah, the sound cut out like so much. I didn't hear anything for a second.
Great. Are we back to the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to this because one of the metaphors for interpersonal communications is that it's like a seesaw. And that means that if there's not balance in a relationship, and there's not balance in a conversation, it gets to be, it can get to be kind of awkward and not a productive conversation. Have you ever had have you people ever had that person who just dominates the conversation and you feel like there's no balance in the communication?
Yeah.
There's actually a term for that. There's a term we'll get to later on in the semester, but it's called narcissistic listening. And it's that person who wants to make everything about themselves. And there are a lot of conversations that go the same way. Other analogies, how about a ball game? Can anybody make an analogy between a baseball game and an interpersonal communication situation? Let's take Maeve.
Wait, what's the question? An
How?
analogy about a ball game?
Yeah, if you had to make a metaphor or an analogy comparing a ball game of some kind to an interpersonal communication.
I have no clue.
I'm sorry, a little bit louder and clear.
I said I have no clue.
You have no clue. Angel, you want to take a
Yeah.
shot at this one?
I don't know.
All right. We'll get back to that, and maybe we'll give it to you in an essay quiz. But they say a lot of the other metaphors, a TV sitcom and a rubber band. So I don't know how you'd necessarily make those analogies, but maybe we'll have you make it later on in some sort of a quiz. So think about how it would be. Interpersonal communication, like a seesaw, we've talked about, it's best when it's balanced, like a ball game, like a TV sitcom, or like a rubber band. Nature of communication, the second one, it involves verbal and nonverbal messages. Obviously, verbal is the actual words you say, and nonverbal is kind of everything else, including sometimes tone, although a lot of people look at tone as being part of a verbal message. There are people who will say that words and grunts and the way that something is said is nonverbal. You can go back and forth on that one, but it involves both messages. And a simple way of saying it is, you can say the same thing to me, and if you say it to me in two different ways, I could derive two different meanings from that. Am I correct about that? We'll say that I am. Takes place in varied forms, and then it involves choices. This is an important part of it because choices, we call these interpersonal choice points. And what we mean by that is there are times, and I'm sure you've all had that time where you thought, should I speak, should I speak, should I speak? And you didn't speak. And then you thought, I should have said something. Have you had those moments? Let's say, Meg, have you had those moments where you thought to yourself, I should have said something? Or perhaps afterwards thought, I wish I had said this?
I guess, yeah.
All right, can you give me an example?
Well, sometimes, like, if I don't know if this applies, but if you're at like a restaurant or someplace and they give you like the wrong order,
Yeah.
I never like say anything to the server. I just like basically eat what's given to me, and I always feel like I should speak up, but I never do.
You know, there's a question that people sometimes get asked in job interviews. They say, if you're at a business lunch and you order the meat medium rare and it comes in well done, what do you do? And the reason that they ask that is they want to see what kind of a thinker you are and what kind of a communicator. And if you don't do anything, they say, oh, so in other words, you could get a bad meal, which might mean that your companions at the dinner might also get a bad meal, but you're not going to stand up for yourself, which might be also be standing up for them, simply because why? Because you don't want to make a stink, you don't want to rock the boat, you don't care about quality service. And of course, conversely, it is, if you're at the business meeting and the point of the lunch is the business lunch, do you want to make a giant deal about the food and be distracting? So it's an interesting decision to make, but it does come up. It does come up as a choice point. You know, when do you make a stink and when do you don't? Anybody else get one like that? An interpersonal choice point that they can identify where they thought they should say something and they didn't, or they said something and they wish they didn't?
Yeah.
Okay, who's this?
Emily,
Hi, Emily. Could you give me an example?
maybe like in an argument, if you like were all worked up and you didn't say like the main point of your argument, and then later on when you're thinking about your argument, you're like, oh, I should have said this.
Yeah, that's an excellent example as well. So yeah, these are all interpersonal choice points. And there's another one really comes to mind. You guys, I don't know what the state of bullying is now, but have you ever seen somebody being bullied or somebody make a racist or a homophobic comment and you thought, I should really say something, and then you didn't? Or maybe you said something and you might have overreacted to something? Have any of you run into that situation?
Yeah.
Okay. Is bullying still a thing at Haverhill High School?
I have to say, I've never seen someone get bullied like with my own eyes.
Okay, you've been
People
fortunate.
are literally getting bullied right now on social media.
Yeah, I think it's more social media. It's like people are like,
Oh, social media is the worst.
yeah, people don't really do it in person anymore.
We went in person at Timberlane.
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I said at Timberlane, do it in person. Like, I've seen kids get bullied in person at Timberlane.
Okay. It looks like this slideshow has moved along on its own. So we're talking about source receiver, and the source, of course, being a source receiver, which is a role that in a conversation generally both parties or all parties play. there's obviously interpersonal competence plays a big role, and that's basically making the good choices on the choice points, saying what you want to say and saying what's appropriate at the time. Sometimes saying what you want to say is not necessarily appropriate. Maybe you want to hold it for another time. It's sort of like the idea of if one of your friends says something and you know it's wrong, do you say it in front of witnesses, or do you pull them aside afterwards or her aside afterwards and talk to them then? Though that's kind of an interpersonal choice point. And in some cases, one person you might call out in front of others, and another person you might wait until you're alone based on who they are and what your relationship is with them. Source receiver, we talk about interpersonal competence, and one of the concepts you're going to hear in the book is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a really big thing right now. It has been for a couple of years. And mindfulness is basically having a mental awareness of what's going on and being aware of living in the moment. And mindlessness, of course, is the opposite. And that is basically going along and, saying things and doing things and acting in a way that might be long-term detrimental or even short-term detrimental, and you just don't notice it because you're just not aware. I think probably some of you know people, or maybe you've been that person that said the hurtful thing and they really didn't mean to say the hurtful thing, but they just didn't have an awareness of how it was being received. If you haven't seen it, you will see it, and probably you have seen it, and maybe you've even been either the recipient or you've been the source of the mindless hurtful thing. Communicating with mindfulness it's a whole school of thought, and it deals with kind of recognizing the categories that certain communication fits into. The category of the close relationship versus the category of the business relationship versus the category of the impersonal relationship. Being open to new information and to new points of view when it comes to a certain circumstance, a certain situation. Not relying too heavily on first impressions, because as we'll discuss later in the book, first impressions aren't always right. And we tend to rely on impressions, and sometimes we get a very favorable impression, let's say of an athlete. You might hear about LeBron James or another athlete, and you might think, oh, that guy's great. And then maybe you'll hear some things later on that are kind of negative about that person. And you might think, he's not, he would never do that. He would never do that. He's a great athlete. And I always see him smiling on his commercials. And so then, maybe you've got that positive feeling. The same way, if you hear something negative about somebody, then that might stick, because the bad news, as they like to say, bad news will travel halfway around the world in the time it takes good news to get out of the garage. So in many cases, they talk about, if you want to be a good mindful thinker, don't rely too heavily on first impressions. Also, you want to be aware of your possible misinterpretation, and you want to remain fluid in your thinking, and you want to be aware of your conscious unproductive patterns of thinking. You just want to be kind of aware that, sometimes I see people like that, sometimes I see people in suits and I have a negative feeling about people in suits. You hear a lot of stuff now about bureaucrats in public health, all the people who don't want to be stuck inside with COVID-19 situation. We'll talk about the bureaucrats in their, in public health. Well, they're not all bad. And sometimes it's just a conscious or unconscious misinterpretation of the way somebody is based on, what they wear and what job they have. And it can be an unproductive pattern of thinking. You want to be aware of the uniqueness of every situation, and you want to be able to identify and evaluate the communication choices that you have in every situation. So really being mindful is really about just being there and being present and not being pulled along by any external factors such that would block you from living in the moment and having an awareness. I hope that makes sense. Does that make any sense? We'll just say it does.
Okay.
Cole, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Encoding and decoding, we've already talked about. Also code switching. Cole, do you have friends?
Yeah.
All right. Do you have a job?
No, not right now.
Okay. Do you have parents?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you speak to your friends the same way that you speak to your parents?
No.
Okay. Because you might use different words, different language, different tone.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we talk about code switching, we're talking about different languages, going from one code, one language to another. But even within the same language, there will be code switching. Friends that have got a shared experience, let's say guys who know each other from years of playing on the football team together, they might talk a little bit differently, borrowing from the context of their football experience than guys who are musicians. I was years ago, I came across some musicians that I was hanging around with, and I was really amused by the fact that they use the word cat all the time. Like, this cat did this and this cat did that. And I don't know if it's just a Berkeley thing, Berkeley College of Music, or if it was a jazz musician thing, or if it was just these couple of guys who would use the term cat. But I thought it was so funny and so outmoded. I'm sorry, not so outdated a term, that I was really kind of amused by it. But the same thing you hear when you deal with, like, I see it with younger people, with younger students now. Sometimes they're just codes that they talk to each other in a language they talk to each other in that is just kind of unfamiliar to me. And I'm sure you guys find the same thing exists. You talk to people at work in a different way than you talk to your friends out of work. You probably some people will talk differently around all guys than they will, or all girls than they will against mixed gender groups. And that's called code switching. Does that make sense to one and all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, good. And that's a lot of what this group, what interpersonal communication is. These are the things that you already know, but these are the terms that we use for these situations. And it's getting you to think about these situations consciously and mindfully, versus just kind of going along and thinking, well, I talk a lot, therefore I must be a good communicator. Here's a model of interpersonal communication. As you see, it gets a little more complicated than some of us would think. And when the books arrive, I'll give you some time to familiarize yourself with them. You don't have to read this chapter, but if you want to kind of flip through it and look at some of these ideas again, it's not a terrible idea. Elements of interpersonal communication, more elements. They talk about messages. We talked about that, how they're units of communication. And there's a thing called a feedback message and a feed forward message. Anybody want to take a whack at what these mean? Let's start with, let's say, Jared. Jared's not here. Natalie? Natalie, what's a feedback message? No, Natalie, okay. Let's see, Thomas? Thomas, you're not there either? Jimmy?
Feedback message is kind of when you're just giving someone feedback on something that they've said or like an idea. I don't really know what's the synonym for feedback.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, that's that's giving feedback, but a lot of times feedback messages is as simple as you saying or looking at somebody and nodding. If I'm talking to you and you nod at me, what does this mean? Jimmy, you want to take a whack at this?
Can you say it one more time?
Yep. If I'm telling you something and you're nodding at me, what message are you sending me?
That I'm like complying or I'm satisfactory with that.
Right. You understand it. It's a simple thing. And there are other, and if you've got your brow furrowed and you're squinting at me, what does that indicate to me?
That whatever you're saying is maybe like confusing or
Yes.
doesn't really make sense.
Yep, it doesn't, you're not getting it. So those are two simple nonverbal feedback messages. You can be verbal too. You could say, uh-huh, no, that's great. That's really interesting. These are actually techniques. When you're in journalism, one of the techniques that they teach you, if you're using the old method of taking notes as you're talking to somebody, there are a couple of techniques you use, and one of them is to say, that's great, that's really interesting. And that does two things. It's one way of you kind of slowing the person down and controlling the interview, but it's also you're giving that person encouragement to keep going with what they're saying. And one technique that I used to like because it would allow me to catch up on my notes is I'd say that's great. Hold on, let me just catch up to this. So I want to make sure that I get this right, which is doing a couple of things. It's slowing the person down, which you would need to do sometimes in journalism. It's giving them a lot of encouragement to keep going on in that train of thought. And it's saying, by saying, I want to make sure I get this right, you're giving them a little, extra, what do you call it? You're letting people know that you're trying to be accurate. And that's reassurance. You're giving the person reassurance. So those are all feedback messages. And those were used consciously. Those were like things that I developed as conscious techniques. And obviously, a lot of us will do the same thing in business, in personal conversations, and in academic situations. Now, a feed-forward message is a little bit different than that. Jimmy, you want to take a whack at the feed-forward message?
I mean, I'm thinking it would be like the opposite. Like if I'm giving someone information in hopes for like, I guess, confirmation or like some sort of I'm good with this, I'm not good with this kind of response.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. It's feed forward is kind of setting the stage. You know how you tell somebody, usually when you talk, you just talk. But every so often you've got a particularly important, or some people will do it if they think they've got something funny, or some people will say it if they've got a long story to tell. But they'll preface it with a feed forward message. Like, for example, Jimmy, I know this has never happened to you, but imagine if you came home with a really bad report card and you had to show it to your parents. You might give them a feed forward message of, Mom, you might want to sit down for this. Or I've got to talk to you about something really important or really disappointing, or I've got to talk to you. And so you might set the scene, or you might decide not to go with a feed forward message and hope she'll just sign it and go on. Do parents still sign report cards?
We get most of ours on, well, I know my school does this, but we get it online now.
Okay.
And our parents like can go into our grades and just look at all of that. It's all under one like system.
So it's not as big an issue, although some people would probably still, if they got an uncharacteristically bad report card, they might want to do something to kind of brace their parents, help their parents brace for the bad news. Same way if you were going to, let's say, break up with a girlfriend, or if you wanted to ask a girl out and you wanted to be sure you had her attention when you asked her out, you might say something like, listen, I'd like to talk to you about something, would you like to blank? And it's sort of setting the stage for the bigger question. So that's a feed forward. If you're going to talk to your boss about a raise, you might want to ask for, do you have a minute? Do you have a minute? Do you have 5 minutes? That's a common form of feed forward message. A lot of times if you have to talk to somebody, you might say, You might send a text and say, hey, do you have time to talk on the phone right now? And the person can say yes, the person can say no. Does that make sense? We'll assume it does for one and all. So we'll move on. Channel, as we talked about, that's the form of the medium. That's the form of communication. I'm going to talk to, and it can be everything from I'm going to send a text to I'm going to send this message through my friend, and I might even send a feed forward message through my friend. Hey, Tommy wants to talk to you. Dave wants to talk to you. That sort of a thing. Noise, as we've talked about, that can be physical, like the actual noise in the room. It can be physiological, like here's a person who doesn't have particularly good hearing or doesn't have sight or has limited sight. So you might want to talk about that. Or you might want to be aware of that, not talk about that, but be aware of that if you talk to that person. Psychological, you might deal with somebody who's got preconceived ideas about somebody or something. You might talk to somebody who's got a kind of a wandering attention. We all have different listening styles. And as you develop more keen awareness of it, you'll kind of understand that some people, this is particularly true in work. Some people, they only want to know what the bottom line is. Some people, they only want to, they're very time oriented. They don't want anything, they don't want to hear long stories. They just want to hear everything really quickly. But these are the psychological things. Some people have biases. They might be very emotional about certain topics. In Massachusetts, politics, so many people are so politically charged that you have to watch what you say, or you have to present things in a certain way if you want to get them to listen and get past their biases related to politics. And then finally, there's the semantics, which is language, cultural, but that can also mean jargon or complex terms. We have different meaning systems in our world, and you have to be aware of what they are when you communicate with somebody. And again, the simple explanation is this person speaks English as a second language. You might have to be sure that they understand, depending on how proficient they are, you might want to be sure that they understand the message. Or if you talk to somebody who's a computer technical type person, you might want to be sure that you're understanding what they're saying. It can be tricky, and you want to be aware of all of these types of noise, which are basically things that interfere with the message, interfere with good communication. Context we'll talk about a million times all the way through this course. There's everything from the physical dimension, where, and temporal dimension, when, not just the time of day, or we're this close to deadline, or the bomb is about to go off. We don't have time for you to tell me your feelings about me. It's very nice, but I got to defuse the bomb. So where the message fits in the moment is part of the temporal dimension, but also what time is it, and also, what time is it, day, night, March, April, early in the COVID-19 process, late in the COVID-19 process, any of that stuff. That's all part of the temporal dimension. It should all be part of the context of your communications. The social psychological dimension is where are you on the social ladder? Where are you in the where do you fit in relation to the person you're communicating with? If you're the employer and you're dealing with the boss, that's going to be a lot different than if you're, let's say your boss is your mother or your father, and you're working for them at work. Are they your mother? Are they your boss? They're both. So you might treat them differently. I remember a mayor years ago, I said, how would you like me to refer to you as? And she said, oh, you can call me, I'm trying to think of her first name. You can call me by whatever her first name was. She goes, unless there are people in the room, then call me then call me Mayor. And so that's what I did, because that's what she was comfortable with. And she liked that formality, and she was more comfortable with that formality. And so when it was the two of us alone, we were still professional, but we were a little bit more relaxed than when there were people around. We were less formal, and we were a lot more formal when there were people around. Cultural dimension, that's the beliefs of the sender and the receivers. Obviously, we all come from different cultures, and sometimes you want to be aware of that as you deal with people. And that has a lot to do with the context of communication between people. Finally, there's ethics, which we're going to have to cover at another time because I want to get through this and get you guys out of here before 1:30. Principles of interpersonal communication. It's a moving to the next one. Principles of interpersonal communication. It's a transactional process. I say something, you say something, I say something, you say something, back and forth it goes. And what I say doesn't exist in a vacuum, and what you say doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's all in this context between us. It is a process. It is a process. Things may change as it goes along. The elements, as we talked about before, they're interdependent. They're dependent on each other, but they're also they're all individual minded. And finally, the mutual influence. And this is absolutely true because, yeah, there's a mutual influence on both. What I say affects what you say, which affects what I say, which affects what you say. This is the one on the top is the kind of the old model that they used to use when they talked about interpersonal communication. It goes from speaker to listener, back to speaker, back to listener, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's kind of given way to this, what they call the transactional view, which is that the speaker and the listener are going basically back and forth, exchanging information, and it operates on a continuum of exchanging information. Mediums. These are mass mediums on the mass communication on the top, newspapers, magazines, television. They speak directly to you. Whereas the social media, which is a different form of, how we call it, a mass communication, you speak back. You know, in the Wikipedia, you can change the Wikipedia entries by adding your own information. Social networks, you go back and forth. Ditto for dating sites, video and photo sharing, etc. All the social media, you're allowed to go back and forth. And so they're a lot more transactional than the traditional mass media. Interpersonal communication can be used to learn, as hopefully some of you have today, or maybe you've just become more confused, I'm not sure. It can be used to relate to people in different ways, whether it's boss, employee, or mom, son, or boyfriend, girlfriend, girlfriend, girlfriend. Any of that, it can be related to, it's important in relationships of all kinds. It's important as a way to influence. If we couldn't communicate, we couldn't persuade, nothing would change. And influence and persuasion are an important part of life. We use them, interpersonal communication, to play, from watching a show on television to just going out and having fun, and also to help, because some people, and I'm sure you've, on a more dramatic side, example, we might say one of your friends is kind of clearly in trouble. They're not saying I'm in trouble, but you're observing certain things that they're doing, and you say, wow, you know, Bob seems really depressed. And so maybe you reach out to Bob, and it turns out that Bob is having some difficulty, and you can go get him some help. And so it can be used in that form as well. There's no, I don't think there's any interaction between people that doesn't involve some communication. Whoops. So we talked about it. It's ambiguous. It may not always be clear to everybody. It requires some interpretation. And unfortunately, anything that requires interpretation might be misinterpreted. In some cases, interpersonal communication is symmetrical, which means that people will mirror each other's behavior. A simple example is a couple that fights a lot. He's fighting because she's fighting, because he's fighting because she's fighting. And then they might, there are some that are complementary, which is basically he's reacting one way to her because she's doing this, and it can be a good thing or a bad thing. But in some ways it's symmetrical. Somebody's a rival of somebody at work, and so they're rivals in all ways. Or they're complementary, which is that they kind of interact in a acting differently, but achieving the same goal. Interpersonal communication refers to content and relationship. We've talked about that. And it's a series of punctuated events, which is a sequence of stimuli and response. The example in the book is they say you've got a wife they're out to dinner, a wife and a husband are out to dinner. She's texting her sister, and he starts flirting with the waitress. And so she's annoyed with him because he's flirting with the waitress, and he's annoyed with her because they're supposed to be out to dinner and she's texting her sister. And maybe she feels that she's texting because he's flirting with the waitress, and he might feel that he's flirting with the waitress because she's texting. And this is a punctuated event. And if you put enough of these punctuated events together, you've got a pretty awful marriage. And it's always a good idea to be able to be mindful of these, make good choices, and figure out a way from a communication standpoint to affect your communication in whatever direction you want to affect it. And maybe the next communication is let's get a divorce, or maybe the next communication is, hey, let's talk about this and work our way to a better future. There's the models of the flirting, texting, flirting. I got to get rid of that slide for the next time I show this. Principles of interpersonal communication. These are three big ones, and these three will be in the midterm and they'll be in the final. Communication is inevitable. Even if you try not to communicate with somebody that you're close enough with, that you would be having communication with them, if you don't speak, that says one thing. If you speak and you're curt and you keep everything businesslike, you're saying another thing. If you're nonverbal, say you're negative or positive, you're going to be communicating that even if you don't intend to. They're also irreversible. Once something is said, once something is communicated, it is communicated for as long as that other person can remember it. So maybe that person will remember your happy, fun nature, and that will be the impression you make, and you'll leave them with that. Maybe that person will take advantage of your happy and fun nature, and you'll be left with the irreversible impression that makes. But in all cases, once something is said, it can't be, it's done. Once something is done, it's done, and it's irreversible, and it's also unrepeatable. You can't go back and do a makeup. You can't go back and change it. It's happened. You can't repeat it. I mean, you can do the same activity over and over, and then you establish that pattern. But they're all individual communications. So if you throw me a birthday party this year, you throw me a birthday party next year, you throw me a birthday party every year after that, it will be, yes, he or she threw me a birthday party every year. It was so nice and so thoughtful. But it would also be, the birthday party this year had a yellow cake. The birthday party this year, we invited all the relatives. The birthday party this year, we just went out for a quiet dinner. So they're all individual elements. And that's it. And that's the end of the PowerPoint. I'll try to put this up on Blackboard tonight or tomorrow. And that's what we've got. Any questions? Would you like the black? Yes, go ahead, Madison.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was here because you marked me absent, but I think my mic cut.
Yes, I did mark you absent, Madison. Where were you?
I was here, but like I think my mic wasn't working because I was saying here, but I don't think anyone heard it.
Okay, yeah, I didn't hear you.
You probably marked me absent too because I was like 2 minutes late. My thing was like loading. It was really slow.
Who's that speaking?
I'm Elizabeth Howell.
Oh, hey, Elizabeth. Let me, I'll go through the whole list. We'll see who's here and who's here still. Allison, you here?
Yeah.
Maeve, you here? Nope.
Yeah, I
You are?
am. Me
Okay.
too.
I recommend everybody unmute themselves so we can do this. Jada Lee, you here?
Here.
Angel, you here? Angel, you here?
Here.
Okay. Jada? Carabello? Nope. Sophia, you're here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm here.
Emily, Emely, are you here? Emily, no? Okay. Ashley, you here still?
Here.
Okay. Let's see. Megan, you're here. Emily Goslin, you're here. Naelis,
I'm here.
you're here? Yeah, you weren't here at the beginning, right?
Yeah, mine was loading and then it said it wouldn't like go into the
Okay.
like group. So then I had to retry it.
Okay. Courtney, you here?
Yep.
Jared, you here? Nope. Natalie, you're here, you said?
Yep.
Let's see. Tom Canal? Absent. V. Jimmy, you're here? I know
Here.
that. Alice Marvin?
I'm here.
Alice, were you here at the beginning?
No, I was a couple minutes late because I had trouble getting in, but
Okay. I would say if you're having trouble getting in, and I think what's happening with Zoom and with a lot of other things is there are so many people online that it's just taking longer to get things done. So I would say wouldn't kill anybody to log in at 12:10. Eismer, you're here. Madison, you're here. Madison Owens.
yeah, here.
Okay. Libby Powell, you're here.
Yeah.
Okay. And you, okay. And Jaden Shout.
Here.
Great. Cole is here. And Christopher. Chris, you're here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I would say just try do 12:10. This news from the bookstore is awful. And I don't know why they have to do this. I should probably, hold on just a second. I should turn off the recording now. Just because